America, the most unique civilization in history, born as the dream of colonists who risked their lives and substance to forge a new world, dedicated to the pursuit of Christian liberty, private property, and human dignity. This new world offered generations of Americans the kind of life that the rest of the world could only dream of. It came to be called the American Dream. Americans fought and worked, living and dying by the best lights they had to maintain the elusive dream. Today, millions of American men and women still work, live, and die for that same dream. This video will expose D.C. organized crime, America's domestic enemy that pits us, its sovereigns, against one another in an endless divide-and-conquer war as it enjoys the world's most successful counterfeiting, fraud, and racketeering operation. We'll force through Congress 20 sweeping reform laws to arrest these tragic crimes. How will we the people force these reforms through? We will introduce the indictment engine, the long-overdue enforcement mechanism for the U.S. Constitution that, unlike elections, does not require majorities. Requiring less than 1% of the population, the indictment engine is a peaceful, practical, perpetual mechanism to arrest D.C. organized crime. When faced with tyrannical or corrupt government, citizens have chosen a range of responses, from doing nothing at all to armed revolution. In the French Revolution, the long-oppressed peasant majority rose up in arms, and in terrorist tribunals sent France's aristocracy to the guillotine. A much later citizens' terrorist movement was Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, which committed hundreds of terrorist bombings and killings. Apartheid eventually ended in South Africa, and after long imprisonment, Mandela was released and made a national hero. A more peaceful response to tyranny was the Quit India movement, in which Mahatma Gandhi led the masses in civil disobedience and passive resistance to the British government that had plundered India for generations. Because America's schools no longer teach history or the Constitution, and American media adds no light to the darkness, millions of Americans now mimic the tactics of powerless populations, oblivious to the lawful power that has been ours all along. Americans wonder, do we the people have the authority to enforce the Constitution? Indeed we do. Americans won that power only after much blood and sacrifice. As a 21-year-old British Army major, George Washington won the first battle of the French and Indian War, helping Britain defeat France and the Iroquois Indian nations. George Washington then took his unique place in American history as our most beloved turncoat. Britain now controlled America, from the Atlantic coast to the Allegheny Mountains, having also won Florida from Spain. Then, the tide of history turned. As government repeatedly raised taxes to retire its war debts, the American colonists grew increasingly frustrated at their lack of power to govern themselves. On December 16, 1773, they defiantly threw a shipment of English tea into Boston Harbor. But government refused to make concessions, and in fact increased its control over the American colonists. After 16 months of planning and training, on April 19, 1775, we the people began a shooting war against our own government. As the sun rose on Lexington Green, Captain John Parker's words to his militiamen conveyed America's sentiment. If they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Although the Massachusetts militia was forced to retreat, as the day wore on, they regrouped and routed the enemy at Concord Bridge. Forcing the British to retreat to Boston, General George Washington and his Continental Army besieged the King's forces. We the people were making history. For the right to govern our own lives, American farmers, merchants, lawyers, and tradesmen were defeating the world's superpower. Sporadic skirmishes followed. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, the American people delivered our Declaration of Independence to the world. The American colonies became free and united states. After an alliance with the French, we won our independence at the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. After 6 years operating as a loose alliance, the sovereign states finally ratified our Constitution, the longest surviving written constitution on earth, and history's only example of citizens through sovereign states giving birth and setting limits to a federal government. Alas, American rule of law lasted only 73 years. As the European Enlightenment tore at America's social fabric, a handful of wealthy and powerful men shaped opinion in America's major cities through urban newspapers. Even as 19 other countries abolished slavery without resorting to war, Abraham Lincoln's illegal new full-time federal army pillaged and burned homes, farms, churches, entire American cities in a shock and awe campaign that crushed the American spirit and hijacked the Constitution. The elite class transformed Washington, D.C. into a veritable city-state. From the servant of the people, it became our fearsome new master. Posing as the liberator of slaves, a powerful new federal government enslaved the formerly sovereign people and states that had created it. Today, although a new generation of scholars and authors is finally shining truth on 5 generations of DC propaganda, 150 years of programming have taken their toll on our minds. When Lincoln's war ended, the North-South blood feud was simply shifted by the money powers into a perpetual war of partisan politics. For the billionaires that control D.C., the tactic is simple. Keep Americans divided into equal, offsetting halves at one another's throats. Divert their attention and drain their passion on one another. Most importantly, always offer 2 solutions for any problem: pointless elections and a new government program. One example of D.C. programming is the pledge created by socialist preacher Francis Bellamy in 1892. The Bellamy Pledge began with a heel-clicking gesture, followed by a stiff-arm salute to the U.S. flag as the chant was recited. When Hitler's Nazis and Mussolini's fascists adopted the same heel-click and stiff-arm gestures in their national pledges, FDR ordered the American Pledge of Allegiance modified to the hand-over-heart chant that is still recited daily by millions of Americans. Government and private schools still program children to revere Lincoln as America's greatest president. Yet history clearly proves that the Lincoln administration was the launching point for organized crime control of D.C. and the hijacking of our Constitution. Lincoln's war was the pivotal moment in the history of our Constitution, when Washington, D.C. claimed the master's role, transforming the American people into terrorized servants. Yet the U.S. Constitution is no mere parchment tradition. It is the highest law in America. Its first 3 words make clear that we the people are the creators of federal government. Popular sovereignty means that we the people are America's apex sovereigns, the highest level of American government. The next lower level of government is the sovereign states. Seen as a contract, the people in the states were the parties to the Constitution. Finally, the lowest level of the American government is the federal servant that we the people created, defined, and limited in our highest law. Every American attorney and judge must honor this law. Yet the media, Washington, D.C., our schools and federal courts teach precisely the opposite. The Founding Fathers were very clear. The American people are the ultimate power over government.
The basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government.
The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government, lest it come to dominate our lives and interests.
The Constitution was created by the people of the United States, composing the respective states, who alone had the right. The powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. In case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the Constitution, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil.
Legislators and judges alike are the servants of the people, have been created by the people, just as the people have created the Constitution. They hold only such power as the people have for the time being delegated to them. If these public servants disagree as to the amounts of power respectively delegated to them by the people under the Constitution, as a matter of course it should be the right of the people themselves to decide between them.
Larry Kramer, the former dean of Stanford Law School, is a national authority on James Madison, father of the Constitution. His book, The People Themselves, makes clear that the American people are the highest authority in government.
We must first lay claim to the Constitution ourselves, publicly repudiating justices who say that they, not we, possess ultimate authority to say what the Constitution means. We must refuse to be deflected by arguments that constitutional law is too complex or difficult for ordinary citizens. And above all, we must insist that the Supreme Court is our servant and not our master. The Supreme Court is not the highest authority in the land on constitutional law. We are.
But exactly what crimes is Congress committing? Criminal count number 1 is counterfeiting. America's highest law has stipulated for 225 years that only gold and silver coin is lawful U.S. money. But as former law professor John Remington Graham explains in his book, Blood Money, The Civil War and the Federal Reserve, America's bloodiest war was a smokescreen for counterfeiting. The 37th Congress passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862 in open violation of the U.S. Constitution, and Lincoln immediately signed the lawless act. The D.C. printing press began churning out worthless paper that Congress forced Americans to accept in place of silver or gold. 5 years after the war ended, with countless American communities still in ruin, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Hepburn v. Griswold that paper was not lawful U.S. money. But to arrogantly prove their power over government, on the same day the Hepburn ruling was handed down, the banks had President Grant appoint 2 of their hand-picked puppets, Bradley and Strong, to the court. Within months, the court reversed itself, allowing Congress to resume its counterfeiting. These crimes have been pointed out by generations of whistleblowers. In 1884, America's foremost historian published an essay proving beyond a doubt that Congress and the Supreme Court were counterfeiting, that our founding fathers were adamantly opposed to paper ever being used as U.S. money. But then as now, the money power controlled media, and few Americans listened to Bancroft. What came next for America was a tragedy in 3 acts. The bankers' strategic plan to make Congress hand over its counterfeiting operations. Act 1 was the Panic of 1907, begun by banker J.P. Morgan and his allies, engineering a downturn in the stock market. Morgan then had President Teddy Roosevelt appoint him as the White House advisor on banking and finance, establishing Morgan's credibility as he published a false report that Knickerbocker Trust Company was insolvent. That report began a domino effect, causing an eventual 50% collapse of the stock market and closure of hundreds of banks throughout 1908. For Act 2, industrialist Nelson Aldrich took the stage in D.C. organized crime. With a business background in railroads and slave labor African mines and rubber plantations, and 25 years in Rhode Island machine politics, Aldrich also had family connections as father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Thus, the Wall Street press was chillingly accurate in labeling the powerful U.S. Senator the general manager of the nation. After recruiting fellow industrialists, Senator Edward Vreeland of New York, to pass the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, the curtain rose on Act 3. Aldrich convened a clandestine meeting at an exclusive retreat on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Traveling under false names to the retreat, the conspirators included managers of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller family banks and investment interests. The Jekyll Island retreat produced the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which Aldrich himself pushed through Congress. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis published a book exposing the bankers, as George Bancroft had done a generation before. But again, few Americans grasped the truth through a sea of captive media lines, and the Roaring Twenties further distracted the American people. Oh, there was discontent among the citizens then as now about the Fed cartel, but given our ignorance of economics, civics, and the Constitution, Americans were easily led to believe that the Fed knows best, that mere citizens cannot possibly understand the lofty world of finance. By merely allowing the Fed cartel to take the name Federal Reserve, Congress adds to its second criminal count, fraud. The fourth act of the bankers' shrewd play was the Federal Reserve trade name, logo, and seal. Its obvious design to defraud citizens into believing that the cartel is an arm of federal government. The Federal Reserve is no more a part of constitutional government than is Federal Express. But citizens' widespread belief to the contrary for a century establishes the fact of Congress's fraud. As with Bancroft and Brandeis in their generations, one courageous congressman dared to expose the counterfeiting cartel.
This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. The money power intimidates the legislative and executive, both of the nation and of the states. I have seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill.
But once again, with the money powers controlling America's media, most citizens never heard the truth. In the Fifth Act, the banking industry allied itself with a vast and growing military industry to push Americans into two European wars. As with the Bellamy Pledge, Norman Rockwell Art, and much more, the war industry's advertising convinced Americans that foreign wars were now every American's duty. Shocking images in American theaters of European destruction was enough to make Americans take sides, even to offer their own lives for a cause nowhere authorized in our Constitution. As the bankers used Lincoln's war as distraction, World War II allowed the Fed cartel to raise the curtain on the final act in its deadly play. Calling a conference at Mount Washington Resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, using the name of the American people without our consent, the cartel left no choice for the 730 delegates from the 44 Allied powers but to accept the Bretton Woods Agreement. With their economies devastated, their cities in ruin, and no productive capacity with which to dig out, the delegates were forced to accept Washington, D.C.'s help, at a cost, of course. The cartel demanded that they tie their currencies to its Fed-branded paper U.S. dollar, with trade between Allied countries and all international loans now denominated in this new reserve currency, and with 35 Fed dollars equal to an ounce of gold. Now, the crime initiated by Congress in 1862 and outsourced to the Fed cartel in 1913 had captured hundreds of millions of desperate new victims around the world. There is no storyline from a tragic novel. It is the true story of history's largest financial crime, a massive fraud more copiously documented than any other crime on earth. Counterfeiting and fraud have corrosive effects on the morals of a people. In addition to destroying their economy, the Constitution has always stipulated that only gold and silver are lawful U.S. money. Fed-branded paper is counterfeit. It has no intrinsic value beyond the fact that we are given no choice by the crime cartel that controls Washington, D.C. We, the people, will now begin to overcome our ignorance of history and our acquiescence in our servants' crimes. But to arrest crime, we must understand how its perpetrators operate. In the late 1960s, criminologist Donald Cressy developed what he called the fraud triangle, explaining the roles played by opportunity, motivation, and rationalization in the criminal mind engaged in fraud. In his book Theft of the Nation, Dr. Cressy exposed a multi-generational alliance between the Italian mafia and federal, state, and city governments from coast to coast. As shocking as the book was in its time, Cressy omitted the largest organized crime operation on earth, the alliance of Washington, D.C. with the banking, military, oil, and dozens of other industries. The fraud triangle: opportunity, motivation, and rationalization. Although Washington, D.C. offers daily opportunity and motivation to defraud 300 million people, D.C. organized crime is better illustrated by a newer criminology model, Crow's Fraud Pentagon. This model recognizes two additional character traits found in every career politician: arrogance and competence. The actor must make convincing appeals to every audience, in every situation, until he closes each deal. As with its multi-generational counterfeiting crime, massive fraud being perpetrated by Congress has been conclusively documented for decades in scholarly papers, blog articles, and enough books to fill a library. Americans now expect everything to be available on their mobile devices, yet settle for 19th century electoral theater and street demonstrations to deal with corrupt government. A constitutional republic designed as popular sovereignty is controlled by a few thousand insanely wealthy families and a few hundred powerful corporations. Another major aspect of congressional fraud is its so-called entitlement programs. The term Ponzi scheme derives from con artist Charles Ponzi in the 1920s, and more recently applied to a New York fraudster named Bernie Madoff. It involves paying off existing investors with money taken from newer investors instead of actual returns on their investment. This has been the scheme of Congress for 2 generations, with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal employee pensions, and other schemes, all of which are violations of the Constitution. With Congress's unfunded Ponzi promises now totaling over $200 trillion, Washington, D.C. is hopelessly bankrupt by any measure. To put its financial crimes into a law enforcement context, consider that for defrauding his victims of $63 billion, Madoff is spending the rest of his life in prison, and his family's assets were seized by the court. What must we, the people, demand our state criminal courts do to those who have defrauded us all of several $100 trillion? Congress has promised private sector workers with pensions that its Pension Benefits Guarantee Program will pay their pension if their company is unable to do so. There are 2 problems, however. First, as with hundreds of other congressional agencies and bureaus, this program is illegal. It is nowhere allowed in the Constitution. Secondly, as of November 2014, that one scam alone has mushroomed from an $8.6 billion deficit in 2013 to $42.4 billion in 2014. To get a sense of the scale of these crimes, this is $1 billion in $100 bills, and this is $1 trillion in $100 bills. Just in the first 8 weeks of fiscal year 2015, the U.S. Treasury has already been forced to issue $1 trillion in new debt instruments to pay off investors of past U.S. Treasury bonds now due. This is Ponzi scheme financial fraud on a staggering scale. Perhaps you wonder, since everyone accepts counterfeit Fed paper as real U.S. dollars, And since millions of citizens depend on federal checks each month, why would we want to arrest Congress's crimes? Now let us see the financial collapse of biblical proportions that now faces us as a result of these financial crimes. Over $3.1 trillion in new counterfeit paper has been created since 2008, and the federal debt is now over $17.5 trillion. Congress's unfunded credit card bill is estimated at between $116 trillion and $220 trillion, while our GDP growth is near zero. Despite government's reported unemployment numbers, the real unemployment rate is well over 20%, which now leaves most Americans with little to spend, making the velocity of money today approximately equal to that during the Great Depression. The Fed cartel itself has only a tiny fraction of the reserves needed to service its liabilities, yet even its Fed crime is dwarfed by Congress's allowing not only banking, but every major industry to write its own laws and to staff the regulatory bodies that supposedly control its industry, with careerists from the industry itself. In the case of banking and finance, Congress has built a financial derivatives house of cards that dwarfs the world's capacity to produce. As we approach the final days of Congress's Fed counterfeiting operation, the U.S. petrodollar was first pumped and then allowed to collapse. Yet no scheme has worked. The major trading nations buy gold at a record pace, as China and Russia face even greater problems than Washington, D.C. This is the point in history at which the war industry awaits its cue to give cover to the world's politicians by sparking a world war. Yet even in the midst of all this criminality, let us consider America's strengths. Today, although wages are declining, we are as productive as ever, with the average American far outproducing the average Chinese worker. America still enjoys the most productive population and natural resources on Earth. We the people can put an end to Congress's 152 years of counterfeiting, forcing it to return to the lawful money we stipulate in the Constitution. But above all, our Constitution is still the most magnificent system of government on Earth, and we the people must enforce it. The third criminal count against Washington, D.C. is grand theft of state land and resources nowhere authorized to federal government. Prior to our present Constitution, the Continental Congress defined an American township as a square parcel of land 6 miles on a side. In Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, we the people stipulate that purely federal land will be only two things. First, a 10-mile square parcel of land, the District of Columbia to be the seat of federal government, an exclusive legislation realm of Congress. Secondly, we the people stipulate that the federal government may purchase parcels of land from the states, with their consent, to build forts, arsenals, and other military facilities. As we have seen, our federal servant massively increased its control of our lives and liberty in the 20th century. Americans in the western states resisted the crushing arrogance of a growing army of federal bureaucrats 4 decades ago, in a contest labeled the Sagebrush Rebellion. These citizens were no rebels, yet they failed to arrest D.C. organized crime because they failed to see past bureaucratic federal agencies to their masters in Congress. The federal courts diffused the Sagebrush Rebellion by employing simple fraud, citing only the first portion of Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. The federal courts conveniently left out the last critical 5 words of that clause. As just discussed, we the people limit Congress's power of legislation to only 2 specific places, within the 10-mile square Washington, D.C., and within military land purchased from the states with their approval. In the final words of this clause, we the people stipulate that nothing in the previous words can be construed against a state's claim on its own lands. As its sovereigns, our ignorance of the Constitution has cost us dearly. Today, although Utah and a handful of other western states are attempting to evict the federal squatter from their public lands, Washington, D.C. still occupies over 640 million acres of sovereign state land, extracting billions annually in oil and gas revenues. Congress is legally withholding from the sovereign states $150 trillion in their own mineral resources in favor of oil industry profits. As a 2012 Government Accounting Office report reveals, the Green River Formation in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming holds as much recoverable oil as the rest of the world's known oil reserves combined. No amount of arguing with bureaucrats or federal judges can end the criminal operations of Congress. The Constitution is clear. It's time for law enforcement against a lawless U.S. Congress in the pocket of billionaires and industry. The fourth criminal count against Congress is international racketeering. We have seen how the Fed cartel took over Congress's counterfeiting operation in 1913, foisting it on the world 30 years later in alliance with the military industry. Now let us consider that industry itself. In Lincoln's era, Washington, D.C. put its new military boot down on these sovereign states. A generation later, that military would begin to be used for foreign plunder. When Sanford Dole invaded the pineapple plantations of the Kingdom of Hawaii, President McKinley sent the U.S. Marines to depose Hawaii's queen, and Dole declared himself dictator. But Sanford Dole was only the tip of an iceberg of American banking, military, oil, sugar, and other industries that began fundamentally transforming American character from the non-interventionist culture of our founding fathers into another swaggering, plundering superpower. A mysterious explosion aboard the USS Maine, conveniently docked in Havana Harbor, was blamed on Spain, allowing Congress to declare war. When publisher William Hearst sent an artist to Cuba to sketch Cuban insurgents fighting for independence from Spain, the artist complained that all was quiet in Cuba, and he wished to return. Hearst responded, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." After investigations, the USS Maine explosion could not be pinned on Spain, but Teddy Roosevelt and the American industrialists had already whipped the American people into war frenzy. Banking, military, oil, electricity, communications, and shipbuilding industries employed the swaggering Roosevelt and dozens of puppet members in Congress to order construction of the Panama Canal and a massive new Great White Fleet. Roosevelt sent the fleet to circumnavigate the globe for the single purpose of displaying the world's shiny new superpower. A multi-million-dollar bonanza for American industry, all for the cost of sinking one ship. In exchange for a $20 million payment, Spain handed over control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the military-industrial complex, using the name of the American people. Over a 120-year period, the banking, military, and oil industries convinced presidents and Congress to send young Americans to invade, occupy, and capture over 40 countries in our name, all in open violation of the U.S. Constitution. Major General Smedley Butler, the most highly decorated officer in the history of the U.S. Marines, wrote a book exposing the military banking industrial monster.
I spent 33 years and 4 months in active duty military service. I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interest in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American Sugar Interest in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American Fruit Companies in 1903. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents.
The old pattern was repeated. An expert of impeccable credentials wrote a book, hoping to wake the American people, and in this case to keep us out of Europe's Second War. But again, a whistleblower's message was drowned out by propaganda in schools, newspapers, and movie theaters. In the midst of the Great Depression, FDR considered war to be the most convenient exit strategy. In a dozen books, it is now established beyond debate that FDR not only knew in advance, but virtually invited the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. His mission? Anger the American people, and create a constitutional pretense to enter Europe's war. The payoff would be ending the Great Depression with new jobs and billions of dollars in military contracts. As we have seen, the Fed cartel had far larger plans for that war. In his 1961 presidential farewell address, former 5-star General Dwight Eisenhower coined the term military-industrial complex, warning that it would destroy our form of government, little realizing what we have just seen, that America's constitutional government had been hijacked a century before. During Eisenhower's administration, racketeers in Congress began enacting, enabling, and funding a propaganda and fear campaign known as the Cold War. As with today's war on terror, the open-ended, nebulous enemy was a word: communism. Had Americans been taught history, they would have known that in fact 8 of the 10 planks of Marx's 1848 Communist Manifesto were U.S. federal policy by Woodrow Wilson's administration in 1913. 2 generations before the war on communism began, Washington, D.C. already met Karl Marx's definition of communism. For D.C. organized crime, fear proved a powerful tool. After developing and detonating the only atomic bombs ever used against humans, the Soviet Union was allowed to steal sufficient military secrets to give the appearance of a fight to the death. Showing an occasional atomic bomb on theater and television screens, government media and schools trained Americans of every age to live in daily terror of our nebulous enemy, communism. In truth, the crumbling Soviet Republic was unable to even feed its people. Raised on sports and pep rallies, America's competitive spirit gave full flag-waving support to the most massive industry in history, the creature that President Eisenhower warned us against, until it now dwarfs all other major military forces on Earth combined. As with Congress's crimes of counterfeiting and fraud, Congress's international racketeering has been exhaustively documented in enough books to fill a large home library. Far beyond Hawaiian pineapples, a third major industry formed the core of D.C. organized crime: oil. Alongside the banking and military industries, this troika put CIA boots on the ground to spark Middle East wars at will, generating billions in profits for stockholders and a handful of ruthless families. Congress's 5th criminal count is domestic racketeering. As with Rome at the peak of empire, corrupt individuals and organizations are drawn to Washington, D.C., the seat of world empire. Once the home of true statesmen, the lawless city-state now attracts politicians whose love of public attention and power begins in childhood and spans long D.C. careers. We, the people, delegated only 17 services to our federal servant. From those 17, Congress has used the general welfare and interstate commerce clauses and many other fraudulent devices to spawn hundreds of billion-dollar agencies, bureaus, departments, programs, and regulatory bodies, each with its own bureaucracy and budget, expanding annually in a web of self-perpetuating waste, fraud, and abuse. These agencies and bureaus recruit millions of Americans into the bottom of the racketeering operation through family welfare handouts, while Congress and the executive branch feed their masters from the top end through corporate welfare handouts. Industry, bureaucracy, and politicians coexist in fascist alliance, feeding off the productive citizens while breeding generations of parasitic citizens, all the while convincing taxpayers that our only remedy is more electoral politics. For decades, both parties in Congress have refused to enforce our borders, finding irresistible the millions of new parasitic citizens who will vote them back into office for a lifetime. Today's tsunami of illegal aliens will have their medical bills and children's education paid by local and school district taxpayers, who will lose their home at a sheriff's sale if they refuse to pay. Meanwhile, wealthy patrons enjoy a steady supply of housekeepers, nannies, gardeners, cooks, and dishwashers at 30 cents on the dollar. As the criminogenic teacher of state, county, city, and school district bureaucrats, Congress leads the coercive transformation of a once free people into another failed communist experiment. This powerful combination of industries has controlled Congress and has sucked the lifeblood out of the American taxpayer and small business for over a century, joined by a ballooning welfare state that now threatens total collapse of the American economy. Congress's sixth criminal count is extortion. No power, foreign or domestic, instills as much fear in the taxpayer's heart as Congress's state-sponsored terror organization. Congress's IRS operation destroys countless American lives, marriages, and businesses each year. After leaving the agency in disgust, the first and last official historian of the IRS wrote a book exposing its systematic corruption. But as with other whistleblower books, Shelley Davis's book could not outweigh government propaganda and terror. Now Congress plans to carry racketeering and extortion to a new level. And be assured, the GOP is only interested in tweaking the massive new racketeering scam for its own uses rather than stopping it. The seventh count against Congress is its daily violations of the Fourth Amendment. As with other crimes, there is a veritable library of well-documented books detailing how our federal servants read our emails, record and store our telephone conversations, track our travels and purchases, and more, all in total violation of our highest law. Now more intrusive than agents in the former Soviet Union, the swarm of federal alphabet agencies has transformed America into an Orwellian police state. Here again is the tragic pattern. For a decade, Fox News analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano has written and spoken passionately to Americans about Washington, D.C.'s criminal infringements of our liberty. But Americans have no way to arrest the crimes. Ending this massive organized crime is the mission to recruit, train, support, and organize the American people to begin enforcing the U.S. Constitution against the criminal element in the U.S. Congress. Let us remember the hierarchy of American government. We, the people, will pursue only our own members of Congress in our own state criminal courts, rather than attempt to stop every criminal in all three branches and the bureaucratic agencies. We, the people, will oversee law enforcement on our terms, in our jurisdiction, where the perpetrators have their official residency. In deciding how best to indict our members of Congress, we review basic civics. Before our present Constitution, we the people and our sovereign states had courts of law. Then, on our behalf, the sovereign states, as parties to the Constitution, created the three branches of our federal servant government, including the U.S. Supreme Court. In Article 3, we the people then authorized Congress to create inferior courts of its own, to resolve matters purely federal. But since all three branches of our federal servant have long been co-conspirators in organized crime, we dismiss the idea of the inferior federal courts. It would be ludicrous to look to the servants of our criminal servants to arrest their crimes. When victims in a state bring a criminal complaint to their state grand jury against another resident of their state, federal courts have no jurisdiction. If the defendant happens to be a member of Congress, the federal courts also have a conflict of interests. This brings us back to the higher courts, those of our sovereign states. In the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, we the people stipulate that the Constitution is America's supreme law, and the judges of every state shall be bound by it. This means not only that all judges will obey the Constitution, it also means they will enforce it. When one perpetrator of infamous crimes is the U.S. Supreme Court, that fact disqualifies it from adjudicating the matter. This operative popular sovereignty was offered by Alexander Hamilton in the 28th Federalist as a guarantee to the delegates of New York to entice them to ratify the new Constitution. Hamilton warranted that we the people can employ our state servants to arrest our lawless federal ones, and our federal servants to check lawlessness in our state servants. In all cases, Hamilton assured us, we the people would preponderate. This is the lawful power that we the people have always possessed but never exercised. Now, we must begin a new way of life. Responsible sovereigns enforcing our highest law at last. Let's preview just the first of the 20 reforms, called the Bring Congress Home Act. At present, Congress spends $5.8 billion annually on its own salaries and operations. Average congressional salary is 350% of U.S. median household income. Congressional and staff salaries and benefits total $2.5 billion annually. Yet, factoring in federal holidays, weekends, and recess, Congress is in session only 1/3 of the year. This reform law will bring them home to work full-time from their district offices and close down all Washington, D.C. operations of Congress. We'll limit them to 2 terms and put an end to pensions, limousines, spas, hairdressers, health insurance policies, and other perks. To represent us, our servants in Congress must live among us, facing the same challenges that we, their sovereigns, face every day. By closing down their opulent neo-Roman Capitol Hill complex, we will save over $300 million annually, even after a $20 million expense for teleconferencing systems. Given their long history of arrogance and criminal behavior, this must be the first reform we put in place, to split our servants up to work under our supervision. Some will say that a majority of Americans will never take on the responsibility of self-government. But law enforcement does not require majorities as electoral politics does. To operate effectively, the indictment engine will require less than 0.5% of the adult population. As it builds membership to support fully staffed operations, we'll recruit as many honest members of Congress as possible. Then we'll launch the indictment engine, with 3 identical cases in 2 large states, so that even if a prosecutor, judge, or grand jury is paid off or intimidated, 2 courts will remain to hear the same historic cases in the state in the same calendar period. This will make it difficult for organized crime to turn back this page in history. Some may believe that every member of Congress can plead ignorance, or simply deny that they ever willfully engaged in crime. Every member of Congress will be given the opportunity to sign an immunity deal and end his criminal negligence, and no one in Congress can plead ignorance to the Constitution or to the massive crimes we have just reviewed. Such implausible criminal defense pleadings failed in the Nuremberg trials, and the Tokyo war crimes trials. As you have just seen, those crimes pale in comparison to the organized crime operations committed in our name by Congress with willful complicity of presidents and U.S. Supreme Courts since 1862. If we the people fail to act, organized crime will continue to act, ever more ruthlessly, and our children will have no more hope of liberty, privacy, and property than the people of Russia, China, Mexico, or Afghanistan. As with our forefathers, today we the people face a crossroads in history. Our lawless government is not a monarch and Parliament half a world away this time, but our own criminal servants who've locked us out of our own homes, are skimming our payroll accounts, and defrauding us on every hand. The largest, longest-running, organized crime operation in history must end. By law, we the people are the only power that can lawfully end it.